Hello and welcome for the Swine Disease Reporting System 102 edition of the monthly report. My name is Giovanni Trevisan for the SDRS.
Hi, I'm Daniel Linhares, also with the STRS team.
I'm Willa at the SDRS team.
And today we're going to cover the finds from the month of July of 2026. But we have the pleasure to have as our guest Dr. Cesar Corzo joining us on the podcast. Dr. Corzo is associate professor at the University of Minnesota and works as director of the Morrison Swine Health and Monitoring Project. Dr. Corzo works on the forefront of disease surveillance in the United States swine pork industry, and his work has helped shape how the industry tracks, understand, and report major disease in the U.S. swine industry and globally. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Corzo.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you everybody for having me today. I'm looking forward to a good conversation today.
Thank you, Dr. Corzo, for joining us in the podcast. Before we go for a thoughtful discussion with you, when can you provide us the update of what happened in the month of July for the pathogen detection in the SDRS?
Yes, so thank you, Doc. There's a lot of good news in terms of pathogens activity in July. Let's start with influenza A virus. So the overall activity for both categories has been calmed down following the downward trend in July, following the decreasing trend that we observed since May. Especially for the positivity in the adult cell farm, we've seen that it's also dropped to 12% in July, and it also marks as the second at also the lowest level we recorded since 2014. At the state level monitoring, we observed that Iowa and Ohio are all showing activity above the expected range. Moving on to Mycoplasma pneumonia, it also continued the downward trend with positivity decreasing from 16 in June to 13% in July. And lastly, bringing some encouragement news in terms of PD and Delta coronavirus. As we observed in 2026 so far, we have seen a lot of increase in and also outside of the expected range. However, the activity for these both pathogens has been calmed down pretty much in July. The last pathogen we want to mention is the PCV2. So the activity increased a bit in the winter market side, with positivity rising from 31% in June to 33% in July. And that's also the second highest July positivity we observed since the last five years. The activity for PCV2 also increased in the adult cell farm. However, when we look through 2026 overall, except for January, activity in the adult cell farm has stayed relatively below 30%, which is lower than we typically seen in the previous years. And there were some drop in CT values in certain regions. So although these observations may cause some attention, SDR is still actively monitoring the situation and also exploring the potential drivers of these trends. So moving on to our next activities, the last pathogen would be PRRS. It also continued to decline in July following the decreasing trend in June. However, at the state level, we are still seeing several states like Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois continue to show that PRRS activity above expected levels. On the just giving you some insights on the variant, PRRS variant, that in July, SDRS has identified the first detection of the variant 1A.29 in Louisiana and 1C.2 in Tennessee. And giving you some more context in the variant 1A.29, so it was first emerged in our database in Iowa in 2017 and has since then has been detected in the total of 12 states. Notably, in 2026 alone, already accounted for detection of 4 states. In terms of the number of detection of the variant 1A.29, we seen as it reaches peak in 2021 with more than 270 detections, and after that dropped to only 39 detections in 2025. However, in 2026, we observed that there are more than 90 detections so far of this variant. So this is something to bring our attention in the renewed activity of this variant in this year.
Thank you, Win, for the insights. And Dr. Corzo, when you look specifically at PD, let's start picking your brain there. The activity has calmed down as expected, right? It's summertime here, but when we look at the whole cycle this year, PD has stood up and above expected the historic SDRS levels for most of the year, and the MSHIMP program is also reporting one of the highest cumulative incidence levels right in this current season here for PD. Altogether, what is the story we think you're telling for the industry as far as PD activity here in our country?
That's a good question, Daniel, and you and Giovanni, and I mean the whole team at ASU. I think you guys and us, we have been able to provide a good amount of data when it comes to PED, right? And this year was, I don't think it was atypical from a perspective that yes, we saw again another epidemic, but this year the epidemic was a bit different in the sense that it started a bit earlier and the magnitude was quite large or larger, right? To the point that your estimates were all surpassed that threshold. Our estimates, I mean, pretty much show that I think it was our third highest cumulative incidence since 2013. So when you look at that, you clearly ask yourself lots of questions, right? And I feel like what this is telling us is, of course, the pathogen is still there, and the pathogen is still taking advantage of every opportunity, right? And by that I mean, I think we may be, I don't know if we're just giving the pathogen enough breathing area for it to remain endemic, which we know that that's happening, but because this pathogen seems to be quite clustered in time and space, we always wonder what do we need to do to remove those endemic populations from those regions so that we can avoid this kind of situations. In other words, what I'm trying to say is we have been living in a world in which, yep, sow farms seem to be healthier. Every now, the occasional break, as you guys have reported and as we report. But the one thing that strikes me is that we've been getting too comfortable with the 5%, 7%, 8% cumulative incidence in some years. But I think what we tend to forget is that on the other end, and this is coming from Lucas Ferreira's project, the trailer contamination project, the amount of PE that we're moving in the growing herd is just impressive, right? The things that a good chunk of that goes unnoticed, right? Because those are very late infections that may not make you guys' project. I mean, we're not tracking that, but we're seeing it at the harvest plant. So I feel like we may be brewing a lot of PEDV in the finishing floors that may be heading back to the either to environmental contamination that ends up helping that virus reach breeding herds. So, in other words, I feel like what this is telling us is that we're still giving the virus opportunities for it to reach those susceptible populations. How? I think we know how this virus transmits, and I wonder if it's more lack of compliance, or do we need to wash more trailers, or do we need to be paying more attention to compliance? So I think it's a little bit of everything that may be happening, Daniel. So that's kind of my 10,000-foot view at this point, right?
Yep, and that's a good point on PD about this regional activity and outbreaks there. But also we have PRRS in the industry, and that has been the beast in the room there. And if you look for SDRS, the PRRS seems to be according to what was expected for the year, but what the people don't realize is that the model predicts an increase in PRRS-wise activity, and that's happening. Now, if you go for MSHIMP, there seems to be more herds that are on the status 1 of PRRS virus during the year of 2025-26 period there. I want to pick your brain, Dr. Corzo. What's the implication for the industry having more herds in this status 1, and what does this represent for the industry in terms of PRRS virus current scenario in circulation?
Yeah, that's a good one, Giovanni. And let me take us back to I want to take us back to 2021, the summer of 2021, when you guys and us, when we were working together trying to figure out the emergence of what we used to call, remember, the 144, that then it became
Mhm.
L1C.
Yeah.
I feel like this year we're living the same exact scenario, right? And I think that the emergence of this new one, the L1C 532s and 35s and all these new viruses that are really good at transmitting, that are really good at amplifying within the pig, that are really good at remaining viable outside the pig, has led us to the situation where we are today. So I firmly believe that that has contributed to more herds becoming infected, right? Uh, Especially those herds that are in the middle of, or not in the middle of nowhere, but that are in regions where PRRS maybe hadn't been seen ever, right? So I think that has contributed to adding more herds to our category one. And as I was mentioning at Pork Expo, I think we have reached the highest point over the course of our project in the sense that we're starting to flirt with that 40% of the herds in our project being in category one, whether they are in the early stages of the epidemic or the latest stages of the epidemic. And that's concerning, right? Because when we say 35 to 40% of the herds, that's roughly for people that are not familiar with the project, I'm going to put it in simple terms. That's roughly 300 to 400 sow farms, right? That if you multiply that by the average numbers of sow herd size, you're going to get a number, right? The concerning part is that if you put that into perspective, roughly we may be weaning today, I don't know, somewhere between 500,000 pigs, 600,000 pigs, that at least one pig in that group of pigs that are being weaned on a weekly basis may be carrying a virus. Which means what? If we just make simple calculations, on a per month basis, 2 million pigs are going out into Midwest, South Central, pretty much around the country, right? Carrying a specific virus, whether it's a virulent one or a not so virulent one. But again, it adds to that pot of infectious population. That if you put it into perspective, today I think the U.S. I think we're harvesting what 10 million pigs a month or something like that, 10 and a half, maybe 11. If you put those two together, so we're adding to the pot 2 million pigs on a monthly basis that may be PRRS carriers, and we're harvesting 10 million pigs. I mean, we're talking about 20% of our growing pig population that we're adding every month that are PRRS carriers. When you put that into perspective, and if you divide that 2 million in the number, I don't know what's the average herd size of a growing herd, 2,400, 4,800, that could be 100 sites, 200 sites a week that we may be filling with PRRS positive populations. So when you ask that question, Giovanni, I think the implications are huge, right? Because we're just adding more infectious pigs into our already complicated mix of multivariant landscape of PRRS that it just complicates our life dramatically. And not to mention that, hey, you've heard it from others. Our industry is on wheels, and it'll continue to be on wheels, and that brings a lot of challenges to us.
And in both of your comments, you were alluded to the grow finish population, right? And we've seen and talked about that over time here in the program, Giovanni, on the importance of grow finish, right? And that's what you're talking about is they're the amplifying kind of hotspot for virus, not only spread, but we could also say emergence, right? Emergence and then amplifying the spread. So the solutions, we talk about the sow herds, yes, but the grow finish parts, the grow finish side of the story is we need more kind of tools and action there, right? And the question for you is how do we go from data to action, right? The SDRS MSHIMP, they were providing this data on disease activity, on disease pressure. It's the sow herd, is the growth finish, is and those side studies, right? Not side, but complementary studies. You mentioned one on the packing plant. See that the packing plant is also a very important epidemiological contact there for disease spread. What's the next step? How can we use that information generated in those programs, at least MSHIMP and SDRS, to help the industry go from data to action and start contributing more aggressively with this national swine health strategy towards disease mitigation elimination?
Mhm. That's a good one, Daniel. That's a good question. It's not an easy one to answer. And I'm gonna go back to, and you work with him quite a bit with Dr. Mike Murtag, right? And Dr. Mike Murtag would always say, not until we solve the growing pig scenario from a first perspective, we won't solve the whole situation, right? So I think the
Mhm.
data has been there always. I think what SDRS and MSHIMP has done for the industry is great in the sense that because the epidemic is so repetitive, you know, it's so cyclical. I think there shouldn't be any doubt on every single farm crew, every single production crew knows or should know that the epidemic will start in the fall and may stop in, I don't know, mid spring. But I feel like we continue to remind them that the summer is also a risk, right? So I think we're giving them data as far as the risk is there, is permanently there. It's going to be higher in the colder months and it's going to be lower in the warmer months, but it's always going to be there. So by us providing this data, it should already provide them enough justification to start thinking about, if we know that that's going to happen this coming fall, and we are, what is it, 3-4 months away from the beginning of the outbreak again, what can we change, right? What can we change from an operational biosecurity, right? Because today we always talk about, hey, we have biosecurity, but every now and then and I'm sure you guys may see this when you go out with students to farms, sometimes we find surprises, right? I mean, Daniel, Giovanni, I mean, you guys' team go to farms, and sometimes we find surprises from we're not being asked to wear booties or to change clothes or to take a shower, or sometimes we realize that the biosecurity processes that we have in mind may not be implemented as we would like them to be implemented. For the breeding herds, I think it's good. I think they're doing a good job, but it's just the growing herd. And Daniel, your question is good because today you guys show it really nicely. There's a lot of PCR positives coming from your growing pig population, right? And I think it's data from Jose Angulo and Monse Torremorel. I think they said 40% or 50% of the groups weaned PCR negative, they get infected during the course of the growing phase. So when we have that kind of incidents, we say, what are we doing wrong, right? What are we doing wrong, or what needs to be done to avoid those infections? And I feel like the data that we have today, the fact that we're telling everybody
Mm-hmm.
this state, this region within the state, these viruses that are quite disseminating quite fast, that should be something that needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to what am I going to change from a biosecurity perspective? Because if I keep doing the same thing, I don't think we're going to move the needle, right? That's one thing. The other thing is the fact that you guys and us, we have been telling the industry most of the breaks may be happening in Iowa, southern Minnesota, or specific regions in the country. Maybe that's where people need to start thinking, is it worth for me to keep my sow herds in these regions, or should I start thinking about moving away from all this complicated, infectious neighborhood, right? So that at least I can keep my sow herds clean, right? So that at least I can reduce the number of pigs being weaned positive. And then, having said that, we're going to have to start thinking about changes in the growing pig landscape when it comes to biosecurity, right? What can we change, right? When it comes to connectivity, right? When it comes to mortality removal, right? When it comes to transport, hey, just a simple part of transport. Lucas is in the process of generating a summary about this, but we can find PERS on trailers arriving to the plant and leaving the plant, not at the levels that we thought we were going to find them. And we know that there's some viable particles there. We still need to try to isolate if those and see if we can isolate them. But again, there's still certain things that if we want to move the needle from a national soil health strategy, there need to be strategic and structural changes, right? Because today, I feel like we have opportunities. We can provide the data. We can provide all the real-time monitoring that we want and that we can. But if at this level we do not make those operational changes, I feel like we're gonna have to keep living with the virus. Otherwise, it'll be harder for us to stop that transmission, right?
Yeah.
Here you saying is that some structural changes may do some good, some big flow changes may do some good, but if we go back to the basics and implement biosecurity, biomanagement strategies, we can make a dent, right? Can make a significant improvement by if the industry decides we're going to go back to the basics and implement those little things we know that works, right? We were talking about some opportunities there, and I agree with you that we can go a long ways starting with the basics.
And that makes us to think about, hey, this pressure of infection of enteric and respiratory virus is a reality in the industry there. And Dr. Coz, on that, could you elaborate a little bit and picking your brain? What do you think a producer should be pay attention in this second half of 2026 that's coming there, and how that could help move the needle in terms of improving biosecurity or improving animal productivity there based on information that's provided through MSHIMP or SDRS?
Yeah, no, that's a good one, Giovanni. And I think, like I said, the producer already knows that September, October, November are going to be critical months for the whole industry, right? I'm not saying that December, January, February are not going to be critical months, but if the longer we wait to change all these measures, the sooner that we're going to have to deal with the virus, right? So pretty much, I think what I would suggest they do is look at the graphs, look at you guys' graphs, look at our graphs. They pretty much agree, and they're a nice complement to each other in the sense that we have 2 or 3 months to get ourselves on the same page when it comes to what needs to be done before the high risk season, because the high risk season is not going to be October, November only. It's going to be that 6 months, 7 months, right? Pretty much the whole year, but the higher risk is going to be those 6 months, right? So my suggestion is you need to be paying attention to those reports, in that if in your neighborhood you start seeing more activity, and if you haven't done anything from a biosecurity perspective, it's too late. And then now that you're seeing at this point lower levels of transmission, which I don't think it's a low level of transmission today, but just to give you an example, if today we had low levels of transmission, while they're starting or finishing their harvest season, I think they need to start thinking about what am I going to be doing differently, and just challenge the procedures, right? That I would say start thinking about how these pathogens move. I think we know a good amount of how they move, or how can we move them. And I feel like we need to go back and ask ourselves, what is it enough? What I'm doing, is it enough to stop the virus, right? Am I still having opportunities that the virus is taking advantage of to get into my herd, right? And an example is, so we had a postdoc. She published a paper on filtration, right? And how the benefit of filtration. And again, we confirmed what we already knew, but a little bit more data. But I feel like that gives us a good message as far as those herds that are in the middle of high dense regions that go under filtration, they have a lower risk of reporting a break. What does that mean? that those teams are working so hard day after day to be 100% compliant. If they can dodge the bullet this year, hey, that's going to be a great news. Next year, even better. Some of those herds may break every 2 years, every 3 years. But again, when you compare that with those non-filtered farms that may not have, of course, the filtration, but they may not have other measures, that's already telling me something about compliance and biosecurity culture that some of you, our listeners, may have heard of Dr. Jerry Geiger. He would talk a lot about biosecurity culture, right? He was a health assurance veterinarian with PIC. And I feel like that's something that should be used, right, more often. Because today the reports are there, the data is there. What else do we need to tell you? It's going to be really hard for us to tell you the virus is approaching your herd 2 miles per day, right? We would love to have that, right, Giovanni? I mean, you guys have a lot of data,
Yep.
but even if we tell them that, we might be always behind, right? Because these viruses are moving way faster than how we can track them, right?
Well, Cesar, besides the hats you wear here domestically, right? You lead the you lead the MSHIMP. You're collaborated at the SDRS, Lehman, so on and so forth. But then we also have some international exposure. The Lehman China, IPVS, some consulting international. What do you see in terms of ideas, approaches that we may be missing here domestically in the US that we should be paying attention to? Any guidance there for us?
Yeah, that's a good one. And look, the one that I think it's to me because I was so close to it was the elimination of PRRS, the second elimination of PRRS in Chile, right? Back in the day, I was with PIC, and I was tasked with helping, right? With helping. One thing that I learned from that process that I think maybe or may not be a good example for this is that the Chilean industry, even though it's quite different to our US industry, right? Yeah, fewer players, smaller. They still have their high dense regions, may not be as Washington County or Duplin County in North Carolina or Martin County in Minnesota, may not be to that level. But one of the things that I learned from that experience is that even though, yes, her closures were done, some depots were done, but I feel that there was such a nice orchestrated effort by the producers, by the veterinarians. You know, everybody was, regardless of their badge, their company, or whether they were regulatory agency or not. Everybody had the same goal in mind, and everybody was doing as much as they could. But the interesting thing that is that it was everything orchestrated by the producers, veterinarians, with the help of the regulatory agency, in the sense that everybody agreed that they were supposed to be PRRS free by a certain date, given a specific plan, right? And I feel like that regulatory push helped them get to that status. Yes, the program worked well, and it had it hiccups, you know, some drawbacks. But I feel like because the progress was measured, they saw some progress. The last few infected sites, they had a little bit more pressure, right? And they ended up cleaning their herds. So my takeaways from that is that orchestrated work between those different pieces of the industry. I think that was nice. Now, how can we use that here? I'm not saying that we should go full regulatory, but I'm just saying that
Mm-hmm.
we need to start considering again, let's work towards no category 1 herds. If we don't start seeing progress there, it'll be hard for us to see progress anywhere, right? If we don't see commitment there, it's going to be harder for us to move forward, right? So I feel like that that Chilean experience gave me a good sense of that. Now, the other one that, again, I don't know if this, I think we still, time will tell, but Asia, you know, and China. I mean, you've seen how they're transforming that industry with their multi-story buildings. You know, when you start thinking about that concept, I mean, time will tell, but when you start thinking about it, that's an industry that will not be on wheels if they keep building these fortresses, right? The issue with that is that a good chunk of them are going to be PRRS positive. And do we know how to clean those herds quickly or not, right? But what I like about it is that there's no moving pieces, right? Pigs stay there. Few pigs are going to be moved from here to there. So I feel like, how can we start thinking about moving less, right? I know that those are big words. I know that that's going to be hard to execute. But today, I'm just saying that because if you look at where our harvest plants are located, it's inevitable that we're going to have to move pigs, right? We will have to move them closer to the plants, closer to the corn. So I just struggle with this one because I would love to have fewer movements so that we move fewer infectious populations, so that in turn we put fewer regions at risk through indirect transmission, right? Whether it's air, whether it's contamination of a trailer, whether it's, because today what we're doing is we're just trading variants among regions, right? So when I look at that China concept, I say, can this work? I'm not sure we're gonna do that in the US, but I feel like from a segregation perspective, I think they may have a good idea there, right? Now, from an operational perspective and trying to clean those herds that are positive, not so sure. But I like the concept of how do I move fewer pigs throughout my region, right? And then, of course, what is it, Denmark, the ones that are kind of encouraging producers to clean their herds based on price, right? Based on carcass price. Is that a good enough encouragement for the producer to get rid of PRRS? Hey, I think that's not a bad idea. Now, can that be implemented here, given that we have a different distribution, different concentration levels of concentration of farms and pigs in regions? I'm not sure, Daniel, but when I see it that way, I think there might be things that we can learn from different parts of the world that may not be adoptable here, but maybe a start of something down the road.
Yeah, no, good insights. Thanks for sharing that. And would like to welcome again back here in the show, right? Always pleasing to talk with you. And any final messages you'd like to leave with the audience?
Daniel, I guess my only message again at this point is I would like to encourage people to again just try to go back to their systems. And I know that the herd vets that I talk to every now and then, we always have these discussions of and I always ask them, are you comfortable with the biosecurity that you have today, right? Or whenever they're investigating an outbreak, what are your thoughts from a possible introduction route,
Mhm.
right? We don't have a good answer today for a lot of these breaks, but I feel like when we start asking ourselves, am I doing enough? Is my biosecurity actually doing what it's supposed to be doing? Um, I feel like my final message would be, how can we get better at measuring compliance, training our people, and making sure that we find that sweet spot as far as I have my crew throughout all these farms are properly trained. They understand why they're doing what they're doing. But at the same time, I think it was President Reagan who said, I trust you, but I want to go and check, right? I want to go and double
Mhm.
check. How can we get to that level? Because the sooner we find those non-compliant events, the sooner we can fix them, we can retrain people, and we can get ready for the high-risk season, right? And again, that's a constant process, right? That's a constant process. The worst thing that we want to do today is during the high-risk season is trying to do that because everybody's busy. Everybody's trying to get things done, and still be paying attention to biosecurity. So I feel
Gotta keep
that way
pushing.
that yeah, I feel like today they know from you guys' report, from our report, that the storm is coming. What are we gonna do this year to better prepare ourselves to face that storm, right?
Thank you very much, Dr. Corso, for all that insight that you shared with us today. Is a great podcast. So we invite our audience, if they like, to subscribe to our podcast and video reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.